Today I'm going to talk about Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff and Red Notice by Bill Browder. So Fire and Fury was released in early January this year and was the first big book that came out claiming to give an inside view into the Trump White House. I got the audiobook soon after it was released and I listened to it pretty much straight away. I can't really get enough snarky commentary and investigative journalism into Trump and US politics in general. So this book seemed perfect as just a big chunk of gossip. And it mainly fulfilled that purpose. It did suffer a bit from the fact that many of the most interesting parts had been published either as excerpts or just reported on in newspapers. So the book felt a bit like, oh, here's a really interesting bit, but I've already read it. And a lot of the rest felt a bit like filler that didn't add that much. I remember one of the very early snippets that was published, I think by The Guardian, was about how the Trump team had reacted to his victory, about Melania in tears on election night, and about how none of them had really expected or even wanted him to win. I feel like that's a good example of what this book gives you. Tantalising gossip, which will always be denied and can't really be confirmed. But it fuels your hunger for damning stories about Trump and doesn't really teach you much about how the world works or how Trump has changed it. So I feel Fire and Fury was perfect for its moment, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it these days. Fear by Bob Woodward, which I haven't read, is meant to be much more credible and more up to date. So I imagine that would tell you a lot more if you were after a book along those lines. So on to Red Notice. This book, on the other hand, did change my understanding of how the world works. The main part of the book begins with the author, Bill Browder, being expelled from Russia. From there, it goes on to how he and his employees discover that various Russian police and officials have used assets stolen from his company to enact a fraud that resulted in the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Russian tax money. Sergei Magnitsky, a tax lawyer who was involved in investigating these crimes, ended up being put in prison in dreadful conditions. So Magnitsky ended up spending about a year in prison being tortured, trying to get a false confession out of him to say that he and Browder had been the ones to commit the big fraud. And he eventually was killed in prison. Browder was understandably upset about the death of his friend and colleague at the hands of these corrupt officials and wanted to do something about it. He goes into how he ended up helping to propose and bring into law the Magnitsky Act, a law originally passed in the US and now replicated in other countries, including the UK, which allows the government to freeze the assets of corrupt foreign officials. And to give you an example of why that's effective, many of the most expensive houses in London are owned by Russian oligarchs. So giving the government power to hit them where it hurts in their wallets and in their extravagant lifestyles can be effective. Putin's retaliation to this law was to enact a ban on American couples adopting Russian children. And if that is ringing any bells, it might be because where you might have heard about the Magnitsky Act recently relates back to Donald Trump. You may have heard about the infamous Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer who had promised dirt on Hillary Clinton to help support the Trump campaign. After these details came out in the press, Donald Trump Jr. defended himself by claiming the actual content of the meeting was much more innocent. He said the Russian lawyer had actually wanted to talk about some issue with Russian adoption. Clearly, this was a euphemism for the Russians wanting Trump to commit to ending the Magnitsky Act. So, in the process of the book, I got more of a feel for what life is like in post-Soviet Russia than I had before. I also learned something about how politics and lawmaking works in the US and how politics and diplomacy works in the UK. I definitely recommend that everyone reads this book, partly because it's an interesting story, but also because it exposes part of how some very powerful men wield their power. And part of that power comes from the secrecy around it. Some of their harmful actions are harder to do when everyone knows what they're doing. So I feel like the more people who read this book, the more the balance of power tips very slightly in a more positive direction. That said, looking at it purely as a book, I did enjoy it, but not without complaints. A long bit at the beginning of the book goes into the author's backstory in consulting and finance. This has some interesting things which I did learn from. It could have formed the basis of a decent Michael Lewis book. But as it was, it felt quite self-unaware. I couldn't help but feel he was too uncritically proud of his activities in finance, which ultimately were about appropriating wealth from Russians who were ignorant of the value of what they held in the post-Soviet era of privatization. I also couldn't help feeling Browder's introductory descriptions of women were too often focused on what they looked like and how attractive they were. So although Browder is the good guy of the story, I didn't come out of the book particularly liking him. However, I would still definitely recommend people read this book, as the story itself is really important, and as far as I know, it hasn't been told any better anywhere else so far. And while the book is over 3 years old now, it will probably remain an important and worthwhile book for a very long time, unlike Fire and Fury, which is already reaching its expiry date. Thank you for watching. If you want to respond to anything I've said, you can leave a YouTube comment, or you can reach me on Twitter at JIM_E. That's JIIM_E. In my next video, I might talk about The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis and Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. So come back for those.